I'm not sure how many of you have been to any of these before, so I'll just give a brief overview of what we do and why we do it. We're going to set this up as about an hour-long conversation with John Montalbano, who I'll introduce in a second, and then for about an hour, and then we will open it up to questions for you folks. And the idea of this is just to get to know leaders in our midst, to get to know what motivates them, what they think about leadership, how they got to where they were, what they think is important in the world, and I'll get to a bit more discussion about that, but that's the idea. And then at just before 5 o'clock there will be a dinner coming, Chinese food, so you're all welcome to stay for that. And so the idea for this is not only to learn about John, but also to form some community within the leaders in this group. You have all been especially invited because of your leadership capacity and abilities and history. So thank you all for coming. I'm really delighted that you all came. So let me first start off by introducing our guest today, John Montalbano. You can correct anything that I'm saying, but he is a UBC graduate, Bachelor of Commerce. In 1987, he joined the investment firm Philip Sager and North as equity analyst, and he rose eventually to become their president in 2005. In 2008, Royal Bank of Canada acquired that company, and John became CEO of the Global Asset Management division of RBC. This division invests $375 billion for individuals and institutions in North America, UK, and Hong Kong. So John has several relationships with UBC, in addition to being an alumnus. He's currently chair of the Board of Governors. He's a member of advisory board for Sauder School of Business. He's a founding advisor to the Sauder Philanthropy Program, which we might get into a little bit. He and his wife established the Montalbano Professorship in Leadership Studies, particularly around women and diversity. He's established several fellowships at University of Victoria and UBC in international relations and law. He's also a Killam trustee, a trustee of the Killam Trust, and has actually personally given very generously to the Buyers Prize, which one of our interviewers is a recipient of. He's also done many things in his free time, which I can't imagine that you have, but anyway, volunteer and philanthropic activities, including to help found the Take a Hike Foundation, which is for youth at risk, and the Power to the Adventure Therapy Society, as well as serving on the boards of many community and cultural organizations. There was a recent Vancouver Sun article about him in which they described him as a crusader for women and minorities in the testosterone-driven world of finance. So welcome, John, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'd also like to invite my co-interviewer here, who is a student, Miriam. I didn't even ask you, Matejova. She's originally from Slovakia. She's lived in Canada for 10 years. She's a PhD student in political science, a Killam laureate, and as I said, a Buyers Prize winner, as well as a Vanier scholar. She has research interests in global environmental politics, and particularly energy and environmental security in the Arctic and Asia Pacific. She has a BA from UNBC and an MA from Carleton. She's had a fairly extensive working career as well. As an analyst at CEDA, as an economist in Environment Canada, and has worked for a number of intergovernment and non-government organizations in areas of development, health, social, and environmental issues. She's also very active as well in her free time and has been on a number of student societies and organizations, volunteers as a translator for the TED Open Translation Project, and writes short stories, some of which have been published in quite premier media, such as the Global Mail. She happens to speak 7 languages, which is pretty cool.
Not very well. Not all of them.
Which is more than I do. So let me just go back to my original purpose of this. So we originally designed this particular event, this series, as part of the Graduate Pathways to Success program, which is a professional development program for graduate students. And when we developed this program, we thought we needed to define the goal of graduate studies, and we defined it as the formation of scholars who make a difference for good in the world. And we call this particular series Leaders Dialogue on Making a Difference for Good. So basically this is to expand on several of those words that I've used. Success, leader, difference, and good. That's a very succinct way of saying perhaps what we're aiming for here. So Miriam and I are going to alternate questions, and as I said, after about an hour we'll invite you to ask questions of John. So given this is part of Graduate Pathways to Success, maybe my first question, John, will be, how do you define success?
Before I answer that question, I just want to say thank you for showing up. And it's always nervous if you wonder if anyone will show up to one of your panels. But most importantly, through my work at Killam, I know that this is a very intimidating audience for someone like myself, because this is where the thought leadership really happens among the student body, and that's in the graduate studies. So I'd like to thank you for your commitment, first of all, for those words that you said that describe this group. You have to have a commitment to excellence, and you have to be thought leaders to be ultimately in this room, from what I understand, and it's a real achievement. And the university thrives on, this university in particular thrives on research, and this group in particular represents the best of what we have at UBC. So thank you. So that had to get out of the way first and foremost, because as board chair and also as Killam trustee, I recognize how important graduate studies are to any university. So thank you. Can you hear me back there?
Yeah,
okay.
Just speak up a little bit.
Yeah, my voice I don't have this big booming testosterone charged voice. Typical of the industry. So the question was success, and I actually find that one a real tough one to answer on a professional level, and I'll get to that in a moment. In a personal level, it's an easier one to answer for me. My parents immigrated from Italy. It's a classic story of a generation of Southern Europeans that came right after the war. My dad, he again didn't have very much money. I suspect I probably know that their marriage was arranged. They had a good marriage, but my father worked at the mines up in Alaska, northern Quebec, then in Yellowknife, where I was born and my sister was born. The mine that you drive up to and see up at Whistler, Britannia Beach Mines, my dad worked at those mines, and as a kid I went through those little rail cars that you see on the highway. No helmet. Just my dad had one of those little camping lights on his head. Just hit the button, and then we went for 2 or 3 miles, which is what happens in that mine, and then it goes down about half a mile. And he had a smoke in his hand. Things you're not allowed to do today. So my dad lived a hard life. Literally broke his back and was not allowed to work in the mines again, and then was a janitor at BC Hydro. My mother was a short order cook at the Bay downtown. So success for me was respecting their sacrifices that they made for me and my sister ultimately to go to university and have an honest life, and a life that ultimately was successful based on hard work, honesty, and then giving back to the community, which my parents, for however limited amount of money they had, which was limited, it was important for them to give back to the community, which they did. And even as a kid, I remember my mother grabbing me by the hand, and we're going off and collecting dimes for March of Dimes, and 4 or 5 years old, knocking on doors, asking for money. And so today, I have 2 young boys, a 7-year-old and an 8-year-old, and on their Pro D days, like this Friday, my wife Dana, who's chosen to stay home, takes them to Crabtree Corner in the downtown east side, and they make sandwiches for single mothers, and hand them out. And so from that perspective, success is based on not forgetting where I came from. From a professional level, success is a bit more difficult to define, because I really think it's really a function of where you find yourself professionally. Everyone's answer for success will be very different. For mine, as you heard, my firm is responsible for managing about $370 billion worldwide. Most of those billions of dollars are in pension funds and endowments, funds that are to good causes, either for personal security or doing good in communities. We're in a business of trust, and And that trust has been broken over and over and over again by the cycle of greed in our industry. And so our firm, now in its 50th, just over its 50th year, has defined itself based on a culture of ethics, putting the client first. For our employees, it's about collegiality, transparency, meritocracy, and connection to the community. And so as CEO, my duty is to make sure, first and foremost, that we take care of our clients and meet their expectations and do it at a better than fair price, i.e. lower than the averages in the industry. And then for our employees, that they come to work every morning proud of where they work. Ultimately, an organization that treats everybody fairly. So what you'd like to see is equity and equality in the workplace. Equality means true meritocracy, whether you're male, female, a visible minority, or the proverbial Anglo-Saxon male that's 6'5" from Harvard. Everyone has the same shot at success than the other. Equity means that when you're in the role that you ultimately attain, that you get paid what your worth is, not what your sex is or how much years of experience that we pay you what you're worth. And so as a CEO, your duty is to make sure that you tick the boxes and then some for your clients, for your employees, and then lastly, I think you have a duty to the community. And one of the things I believe success has been defined for in our company is that whether we're in London, Vancouver, Toronto, Minneapolis, Chicago, Boston, Hong Kong, New York, we're a community leader relative to most organizations in the cities that we operate in, i.e. our employees not only give money, but they give a lot of time, and we support visibly a lot of causes, not for the sake of supporting them, because we're trying to raise awareness on some key issues, as you've heard a little bit with my background in mental health in particular, youth at risk, and other areas of society that are generally vulnerable and fall off the radar in privileged industries such as the financial services. And I say privileged in that, when you're managing money, there's a lot of money, and that tends to go into the arts and other important programs, but we try to support things under the radar. So that's how I would define success, both personally and professionally. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take the next question.
Yes, please. Thanks.
What defines a good leader, in your opinion?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yes, sorry. What defines a good leader?
What defines a good leader is the question. Again, it depends on the organization that you're involved in, but leadership to me has to be authentic. There has to be some sense that when people are dealing with you, they're dealing with the real you. You're not putting on airs. You're not trying to be something that you're not. Presumably, you were chosen to be a leader for a very specific reason. There were certain qualities that you have as an individual that got you to where you are. And then once you're there, people expect you to take those qualities and magnify them in a way that ultimately surrounds the entire organization. So successful leaders, in my mind, are authentic in a couple of ways. One, they're approachable. Two, they're humble. I think humility in leadership is very important. I think a successful leader creates a strong sense of purpose for his or her employees. So when you come into work as a leader, you've created an environment where people know what the purpose of the organization is. Like, why do we exist? And once you've determined why you exist, what is the strategic imperative of this company? Why this company versus any other company in the industry that you find yourself in? What makes this unique and a strong value proposition for clients and employees? A strong leader also has a strong moral code and establishes a core set of values that he or she lives by each and every day that they walk into an office. In fact, today at lunch, I had lunch with another CEO in a very different industry, the forest products industry, and what was really interesting is he called me based on an article that was published recently on an award that I had been receiving, and Susan and I were chuckling about it because I was a reluctant recipient. I just didn't want to go forward on it. I think it's awkward. Anytime things go well, I've got a saying, this answers your question as well. Great leaders, from my perspective, lead from the back when things are going well, and lead from the front when things are going poorly. That, to me, defines a great leader. And so anytime there's an acknowledgement, I'm almost apologetic to receive it, because it's the recognition of so much work of people around me And unfortunately, the CEO at times gets a disproportionate amount of the glory and the right amount of the failure, because you set up for failure if your firm has failed. So accountability is the last point on that note, is that you're ultimately accountable for the success of your clients. You're ultimately accountable for the success of your employees. You're ultimately accountable for your company having a strong moral compass, sense of purpose, and strong value proposition for your clients. And so for me, as you can tell, I can go on a roll on this one for a while, because one of the challenges I see with leadership, and I see it on campus here, by the way, as well, is that leaders love the idea of being a leader. They just don't like the stuff that goes with it. And that stuff that goes with it is what defines great leaders versus leaders who just show up for personal gratification. And I think that authenticity, that sense of commitment, that willingness to say, you know what, I got it, things aren't going well, I'll take the bullet. That to me is what true leaders represent. We can go into it more in Q&A, because I just feel so strongly that there's so many examples of poor leadership that it drives me bananas.
Can you give an example?
Of poor leadership? Oh, all the time. There's millions of them.
No names.
No, I'll just give you an example where something very simple. When you sit down with a leader and you hear the word I or my and not we and our, that's always something that hits my radar, that it's all about them and not the organization. It's all about them and not their clients. It's all about them, and it's probably not about meritocracy. It's all about how they probably solidify their power base at the expense of their employees. And I, to me, signifies a hierarchical structure that means that everyone reports up to I and not into we. And so from my perspective, that's a classic one that is really symptomatic of leadership issues. And the people who typically have an I mentality, in my mind, are usually the ones, if you had to sort of lump them in a pile where there's ethical violations, they were strong I leaders as opposed to strong we leaders. And we all know where accountability resides. At the end of the day, if you're the CEO, you're ultimately accountable for success or failure, but that doesn't mean you have to remind people of that. If anything, it should be a fallout of your leadership if you've done it well. And so I'll give you, so that's my very generalistic. And you see it in politics all the time. You even see it at universities with presidents. There's so many examples that we can cross that in the industry and come up with a few examples that we're all aware of. We probably, by this time in your lives, have lived through it a couple of times, whether it's in the lab or whether it's something you've done in your life. So that's a big one for me. Forgot who's asking. I'm going back and forth like a ping
Well,
pong.
I'll go on. That was just a rejoinder. So the way I've worded this is, how did you get to where you are? Which sounds a bit self-serving, but how did you? What were the attributes or the circumstances that allowed you to rise in your particular situation?
Yeah. So a lot of luck, hard work and luck. Hard work in that when I graduated from UBC, as much as it was an undergrad at Sauder, what they call Sauder now, Faculty of Commerce, so I landed in the top 5 of all students in my year, which was important because that year was the stock market crash of 1987, 88, and all the industries in the financial services, both in Canada and the United States, were laying off professional talent, let alone hiring interns. They just didn't do it. And so there was five of us that ultimately got jobs, and you can just tick us off from Jeff Clay, Jackie Zahner, or Jackie Hoffman at the time, to Margaret Hyde, to ultimately me somewhere down number 5. We got the jobs because our marks were that hard. Somewhere along the way I realized I wasn't going to be a professional soccer player, so decided to study. And so that served me well. And then I got lucky. I got really, really lucky. You know, I was thinking about going into accounting, just because the environment was so insecure, and I thought getting a professional designation will be very important. And then Professor Wood, Bill Wood, who was a bit of a legendary professor, crusty, tough, intimidating, But he stood up and he said, there's this new program in the Faculty of Commerce. It's called the Portfolio Management Foundation. A number of organizations in New York and Toronto and Vancouver have donated $1 million, and they're going to take 6 students. And those 6 students will manage money. They'll get mentorship, and they'll probably get some summer opportunities. And it's a 2-year program, but you have to dedicate yourself to finance. And if you can imagine, all my life, not having grown up with a lot of money, you don't take a lot of risks, and especially with your career. But there was something about that day, and crusty Mr. Wood, who was actually intimidating but trustworthy, who said this is an opportunity of a lifetime. So I sat down and I thought about it, and I applied for this program. They only took 6 or 7. And what was interesting was all of the individuals that applied, for the most part, and there were 300 applicants, most that got shortlisted had investment experience. I had none. My dad had only invested in Canada savings bonds because you couldn't afford to lose the money that you had saved. And so I went into the interview, and I wasn't apologetic. I just said, look, I know nothing about investments. I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to fool you, but I'm going to work hard, and I promise you that it's worth the risk. That was it. And they said, we've met about 60 kids. They've all tried to pull one on us, and the interviews were with PhDs in finance, CEOs running investment firms in downtown Vancouver and Toronto. And so all the kids were doing their best to show them that they were keen, relatively knowledgeable. But the feedback that came back was I was one of the very few, if the only one at that time, who said, I don't know a darn thing, but I'll work hard, and I promise I'll make you proud. So they gave me a chance, which was remarkable. And so I never forgot that, and I felt that I had a duty to the school then to at some point give back, which Dan and I did recently. So from there I got very lucky. I got a summer job at Phillips Hager and North, and it was run by the former mayor of Vancouver, Art Phillips. And Art is someone that we should all be thankful for if we love Vancouver, because he was the one that decided in 1970 that highways would not run through downtown Vancouver, and that they would not run through or around the perimeter of the city like you see in Seattle or Chicago or anywhere else where there's waterfront. He made that fateful decision, fateful in a good way, that would, I think, solidify Vancouver's beauty relative to any other city in the world for the rest of our lives. And so he was a very respected mayor, a visionary. I had a chance to work with him, and so not only did I get great mentorship, but Art, as founder of the firm, ended up being my strongest sponsor. We could not have had very different backgrounds. He was of incredible pedigree, great schooling, hung out with the who's who in the city, and I haven't even had an etiquette lesson. He's taken me all over to some really interesting places for dinner just to see and meet key business people in Vancouver. So he took me under his wing, took this rough diamond and polished it up a little bit, made it presentable, and then became my sponsor. And it's one of the lessons that I'd love to give to young people or people earlier in their career is understanding the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. It's a critical distinction between the two. And often people mistake the two as being the same. But mentorship is something that, if you're fortunate, you'll find someone in your life who will be your mentor, where you can sit down, talk about issues, get some honest feedback, someone who has no agenda other than to help you. That's mentorship. Sponsorship is earned. So you may have been mentored, but through your efforts, through your character, when opportunities arise, the sponsor is the one that steps forward and says, not only have I mentored this person or not, but I believe in this person and I'm putting their name forward for that opportunity. And usually sponsorship is earned based on personal character, work ethic, and ultimately success in the things that you're working on. And so I had great sponsorship by a number of the founders in the firm, and that really helped me out as well. And that's how I got into Killam, by the way. This Killam opportunity came up. And the Killam Trust, it's a $400 million pot of money split amongst UBC, University of Calgary, University of Alberta, the Neuro at McGill, and then Dalhousie. And then there's a pot of money at the Canada Council. There's 4 trustees, and we're actually trustees of the will. So when Isaac Walton and Dorothy Killam passed away, they left their fortune, which at the time was more or less worth $1 billion, to higher education. in Canada. It's down to 400, so it tells you how the university's frankly overspent the money, because it should be $2 billion today, but it's down to about $400 or $500 million bucks. And so there's trustees of the will, and what a Killam Trust does is go to each of these institutions, and we sit down with people like Susan and others and walk through the adjudication process to make sure that Killam winners clearly deserve a Killam and are consistent with the will in terms of how awards are ultimately handed out to the recipients and why. And so when Bob Wyman was literally on his deathbed, and Art Phillips had gone to see him, and Bob said, I got to step off the Killam Trust. Art, is there anybody you know? And Art said, yeah, there's a young fellow I know at the firm. You probably should introduce him to your other Killam trustees. And that's when I became a Killam trustee. And I tell you, it's one of the most remarkable experiences, because I get to sit down with people like you, far more accomplished than I can ever intellectually be, and hear of the great research that's happening across the country. It's probably one of the most rewarding experiences I've ever had and will ever have in my life. So mentorship and sponsorship, Susan comes back to where it has allowed me to cross this path. So last point, our firm was going through a very dark period in that period between 2000 and 2005. The CEO at the time, very good person, but was too busy cementing his own legacy, wanted to be known for things, and sort of forgot the we and got into the I. And a partnership, as we were, is very fragile. It's all about we, it's not about I. And as soon as it starts becoming a bit more vertical than lateral, things start to fray on the edges. And if there's certain personalities that get seduced by titles, compensation, public notoriety, things start to fray badly and quickly, because you start to get a fractious partnership. So our business started to waver, and we weren't at our best, and ultimately we had to ask the CEO to sit down, and the partners, at that point we had 60 partners, had asked if I would lead the business at that point in time. And so I chose to. And the other thing about leadership is it's a choice. There's natural leaders, but you also have to choose to be a leader, because when you're in, you have to be all in. It's not the concept of leadership, it becomes a burden that you bear to make sure that you've met the expectations of those who've asked you to do it. So, again, sponsored by my partners to become CEO. Long-winded answer. Sorry.
Yeah, my turn. Well, this is one question, but it could be two, depending how you take them. So the first one is, what are your proudest achievements? And the second part of the question, which is what I'm really interested in, is what have you learned the hard way?
Okay, I can answer that one easier. I don't believe in pride. I think pride is one of the deadly sins. Once you start becoming proud of something, you might become complacent. I'm proud of my children. That'll be the one thing I'll say. I'm proud of my children. But otherwise, one has to be pleased but never satisfied. That's the line that we used at our firm, is let's avoid pride. Let's be pleased if things are going well. You have to celebrate successes because the world is tough, and every once in a while you do have to smell the roses. But we're never satisfied. We can always do better. And there's this persistent need for us to always be better than where we were before. So what I'm proud of is my children. What I'm satisfied with, perhaps maybe more pleased than satisfied, is when I look back in my 10 years, because I'm stepping down from my role in a week and a half. When I became CEO, I said a couple things at the time. Having managed a fair amount of money for a fair amount of time and invested in a number of companies, I've seen great companies, I've seen lousy companies, I've seen amazing people, and I've seen crooks. And in my view, the great companies, the tenure of the CEOs were relatively short but impactful. So I promised myself that when I became CEO, I would only be CEO for 10 years. And that's it. No matter how good things were going, 10 years and I'm out, because the firm will need rejuvenation. And sure enough, 10 years, I was at the beach last year in Maui with the family, and someone asked me, how many years have you been the CEO? And I said, 9. And I went dead quiet. I've got 1 year left. And my wife, who's always been incredibly supportive, has said, are you serious? Are you really thinking about stepping down? Because thankfully, things have gone exceedingly well for our company, touch wood. And I'd be allowed to run the firm for the next 10 years if I wanted to. So I thought about it, and looked at the kids. They were 7 and 8 at the time. And I missed much of their first 7 and 8 years, and I'd rather be a better dad than a better CEO. So I sent an email from my cabana to the Royal Bank. Said 1 year from now, which is at that time was just around spring break, February 2nd. It's my 50th birthday this year. So I said, as a present to myself, I'm stepping down on February 2nd, 2015. And the email went completely, unnoticed. No one responded back. I emailed 3 or 4 people. There was nobody responded back. They thought I was joking. And I sent a beer to the next cabana because one of my partners that I'd been working with for about 25 years was next door, just as it turned out. So I sent him a Guinness, and he looks over and goes, "What's the Guinness for?" It's like, "Oh, nothing." It's just my own celebration drink that I put the pin in. And so I had to remind the Royal Bank about 6 months ago that I was dead serious, that I'm stepping down. And they were incredulous. They couldn't believe that I was going to do it. But a couple things. Number one, when you do become a leader, you have a duty to work on your succession plan. You have to work immediately on your replacement, because should something happen to you, and you are the leader, again, whether it's in your world or mine, you have a responsibility to not leave the others around you hanging. You have to build depth in your teams, in your organization, so that it can survive you. In theory, the CEO should be completely and utterly irrelevant and, in fact, redundant, because you've got such a great team around you and they're doing all the great work. So in 2005, when I became CEO, within the first 6 months, I hired a couple of people that I thought potentially would be my successor. And one of those two indeed became my successor and will be my successor come May 1st of this year. So 10 years is your best before date as a leader. I've come to realize that the great companies that I followed, the leader's tenure was somewhere between 8 and 12 years, after which they became stale. People start to tune you out. You get complacent. You get comfortable. You kind of like the role of CEO. It begins to define you. You know how much compensation you're going to make. And that seemed a bit too easy for me. So at 50, my present to myself is to recreate myself with a blank sheet of paper. And I don't know what that means. And I couldn't be more excited. I remember flying back from Montreal, and my good friend that I've known since 4 years old, his name among my closest friends and people at work is Tony the Modern Dancer. So Tony and I, when we came to UBC, we failed Economics 102, along with everybody else, frankly. It was the hardest exam I've ever written in my life to this day. And Tony was devastated that he had failed. This is getting to your next point, by the way. Devastated that he failed. And so what he did was he dropped out of UBC. And literally the next week. And I was devastated to lose my best friend at UBC, because this is a big place. I didn't join fraternities. I was just literally busing in from East Vancouver every morning with Tony, and then busing back home. And Tony's leaving, and so I asked him what did he register for into SFU, which is where he signed up. He said he registered in dance. And I said, "Dance? I've never seen you dance, number one. Number two, you were the wrestling team. You're far from a dancer when I look at you. Like, what are you doing? I mean, you're going through a personal crisis." Anyway, 35 years later, or 30 years later, well, 35 from when he signed up, he became one of Canada's preeminent modern dancers out of Montreal. Spent a lot of time with the troupe Marie Chouinard, traveling all over the world, and he was the prime dancer in the dance troupes. So Tony, when you go to visit him in Montreal, doesn't have a penny to his name. Not one. And so I sat down with him, and this is going back about a year ago. And I asked him what he's doing now. And he said, I see him about once or twice a year whenever I get the chance to go to Montreal. And he said, I think I'm going to redefine myself. And I thought, you don't have a penny to your name, and how are you going to redefine yourself? He goes, I don't know, but I'm ready. And I just remember flying home just feeling so inadequate, thinking that life has been really good to me, and that comfort is something that I'm too risk averse with now. And I don't have it. And I thought to myself, I'm getting too comfortable. I wouldn't take the same chance as Tony. And it just gnawed at me. I said, no, you know what? I want to take that chance. And so that all came together and got reinforced when I looked at my kids. And I don't want them to see Dad the CEO. I want them to see Dad the something or else, fill in the blank. And they'll fill in the blank very quickly for us. But I really want to. I don't want them to have them feel like they have to live up to me or what they think I am. I want to recreate myself as they're creating themselves. So that's what. So that's just a side story. In terms of the question, was what? What was the question again? Part 2 of the
what
question.
What were your mistakes?
My mistakes. No, what did you learn? What did you learn the hard way?
Yeah.
Okay, so number 1, you can't do it all. As a leader, you cannot do it all. You need to have exceptional people around you. And if you're insecure, you're doomed to fail. And insecurity means that you're comfortable with people as smarter around you. Critical to success. I've seen a lot of CEOs fail by hiring very poor people, but they were comfortable with those individuals because they sat above them in terms of knowledge and intelligence or influence. And that insecurity ensured that they were entrenching mediocrity around themselves forever. And that then went on to define them as leaders. They were mediocre stories in my mind. Patience is a virtue. One has to, if you're a leader, you have to be patient. I was very impatient, young, ambitious, no money, couldn't wait fast enough for some security, some sense of acknowledgement, some sense of self-worth. When you grew up in East Van, and you come to Point Grey, you got to go through Shaughnessy to get to UBC on the 41st bus, and so your sense of self-worth kind of declines, and you start to think that there's groups that are more privileged than you, and frankly, it's one of the reasons why I never joined a fraternity, because I just didn't feel like I belonged in that group. They were all very nice. It was my issue, not theirs. But you can't be insecure. And if you are insecure, your sense of security actually goes up by surrounding yourself with exceptional people, because all of a sudden you're doing greater things, you're succeeding, you're part of a success story. Your self-worth goes up with the group around you that you're winning. If you're not making mistakes, you're not taking risks, and I think that's a big one. People are afraid of making mistakes, and I really worry, frankly, about this generation in one area only, because I think this group of younger people that are coming through, and I suspect you're going to fall into that category, are incredibly engaged and caring people. But I haven't seen, for all the years I've done recruiting, I haven't seen so many young people so caring about what happens around them than now. However, I've also seen a generation of people who have not been allowed to make mistakes. 90% to get into university, the pressure just to get into university. Once you're here doing what you're doing, having to almost be perfect so that you're not going to drag anyone down either around you, i.e. the person you're working with in the labs or whoever your mentors are, and then that scarcity of jobs. But when you get to a place where you can take a bit of a deep breath and you feel like you have some security in the role, your challenge is to be comfortable with taking risks and making mistakes. And mistakes are opportunities for personal growth. And some, as you know, of this group would know, some of the greatest discoveries came from mistakes. So it's not running away, not hiding from mistakes, but it's embracing them and recognizing how you can learn from your mistakes. Facilitation and collaboration are really important. That's another lesson I learned as a doer. I just wanted to get things done, but you can't do it on your own. And as a team captain in many sports, I thought, well, I could just put them on my back and drag them across the field, figuratively across, and you can't. That's an anchor. And so what you need to do is surround yourself with incredible people, facilitate discussion, have a collaborative environment, and once you've done that, at the end of the day, you are a leader and you're going to have to make a decision. A lot of leaders fail in this area because they mistake collaboration for a decision being made. Collaboration is input. It's valuable input from those around you. But at the end of the day, if you're the leader, you have to say, okay, I hear you. And 9 times out of 10, you'll go with it. But there's that 1 time out of 10. After all the facilitation and all the collaboration, you're still going to have to make a decision. And that decision might be unpopular. And that was a mistake that most of us make. You want to be popular. You don't want to be the person that doesn't listen to the people around them. So you make all the popular decisions, and you can't figure out why you're failing. And what the failure is that you didn't choose to lead. And the lesson that I've learned is that, in my business anyway, what motivates people is fear and greed. And you have to be contrarian. When everyone's fearful, that's when you take all of your risk and bet against that fear. When people are feeling complacent and like this world can't get any better, that's when you take all the chips off the table and you de-risk as fast as you can. I still believe that goes for anything you do in life, where you have to take risks. You have to take calculated risks, but you have to be willing to go against the crowd. Again, in research, it's usually that person who's willing to stand out and be ostracized because they see something that others don't see, and they're willing to take the personal risk to figure it out. And I think the same in research applies to business. You have to be willing to stand out from the crowd. So those will be the more important lessons. Humility is another one, I guess. As much as you can be a success, you can be a failure on a moment's notice. And so enjoy the moment, smell the roses, and then get back to work, knowing that you can fail at any given time. So just humility is pretty important. You don't lose your friends being humble either.
Okay,
Is this a colossal failure, or is this okay so far?
This is wonderful. Wonderful. I'm just going to skip the next one. I think you've sort of touched on some of them, but we can come back if we need to. So I'm going to go sky high and come back to one of the words we talked about at the beginning and good. But, if we're making a difference for good, how do you define good? And maybe that's too big a question, but if you can think, maybe it's easier to say what's wrong with the world. What is the good in the world that you think these folks in the room should be thinking about?
Yeah. What's wrong is easy to answer.
It's
I'd love to
easier.
hear what's wrong with this world. I'd love that question. I'd love people to respond. If people would volunteer that answer for me, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are, because I think we can focus. There's a lot of key things that are wrong with this world. I'll just touch on one thing if I could. I think climate change is obviously very important. The lack of human rights is very important. But I actually would argue that the lack of leadership is one of the biggest issues with the world today. And take a look around and look at world leaders, people who actually do have an influence on our lives. One of the biggest challenges I think we have is that politics are driving policy as opposed to policy driving politics. And the result is that we have incredibly poor foreign policy. We have poor policy on climate change. And I'm go out on a limb and say probably in the 50s, perhaps even in the 60s, policy trumped politics. And I think somehow we're in some spiral until that reverses. I'm not sure how the world necessarily gets to a safer place, whether it's the environment or whether it's human rights or just other personal liberties. What's good in the world I touched on earlier. It was interesting. I had spent a day and a half with the Dalai Lama, of all people, when he was here in Vancouver. And the reason why I had that privilege, and I had never spent or read his books, spent time with him or read his books, but you get a feel for kind of what he stands for. And he's a controversial figure for many different reasons, but I couldn't see them in that 24-hour period why. But he had a really interesting thing. He said when he comes to Vancouver, he really didn't want to meet business leaders or education leaders or someone. He wanted to meet students. He wanted to meet youth. And the reason why, according to his handlers, is he doesn't think he's got a lot of years left. And so he really wanted to touch on as many of the young people as he could for all of his remaining trips around the world. And he was particularly interested in meeting troubled youth, which then brought him to my Take a Hike Youth at Risk program that I co-founded with a number of other individuals who had the foresight to invite me in and help them co-found it with them. And the foresight that they had to start this thing, and I got invited to help them. And so he wanted to meet troubled youth, and he wanted to meet gifted youth. And at a quiet moment, one of the individuals that were with him around the table said, why this focus on youth and not people who can change things today? And his answer was, I've written off this generation of leaders. Literally is what he said. He said, no hope. He said, youth is where our hope is. And it was really interesting because he said, if you want to create change, forget about the current group of leaders and forget about the generation of people that they're mentoring because they've been polluted by the same people. He said, so get down to the next layer of youth who are open to the world and not polluted by what ails society. So he was really, and so that's exactly what he was doing, is he was skipping, the young business professional at 40 to 50 or 55, the people right below them between 30 and 50, and going right into the teens and the early 20s, because in his mind, that's who you had to get to. There's two lost generations that you might as well just give up on. And so he's trying to save them, but he's trying to help us with youth. And so to that point, I touched on it earlier. I'm really excited about a generation or two of young people that are coming through the world, and especially in North America and the New World in particular, because I believe they are engaged in community. They are engaged in climate change. They are engaged. They're engaged about. If you think about technology, the internet's all about sharing, and that there's nothing to be hoarded. Where the generation, Xers and Generation Y arguably fell into. This is a group that what is mine is yours. Generally, to be overly general, but you're seeing a group that is saying what's mine is yours, and that this earth is ours, and it's something that we have to fight for. So I think that's where I think there's a lot of hope in the world, frankly, and I'm pretty excited about where the coming generations are going to lead us to. I also think technology is going to be an incredible thing. 30 years ago, I operated the first computer in Canada in financial services. Me. I was the first one. We were operating an Intel 186, and that was the first microchip. And honestly, I could do math faster than this thing processed. But we did it anyway because we got to check my errors and do a whole bunch of different things. And I think about back then how the concept of technology was to make our lives a lot easier, which it hasn't. It's actually made our lives a lot more complex, I would argue. But what it has done is, I would argue, for the most part, it has liberated the world. The access to information, the access to truth, but also lies, is now apparent to all around the world. I remember going to China. I was cycling in my bike in China for about a month, and there I was in Beijing, and sitting beside an individual that was riding with me through Beijing, because back then it was all bicycles. There's no cars and no motorbikes. It was all bicycles. And you kind of needed to know where you're going, otherwise you got caught in this pack and you can be going around Beijing forever and not getting out to the outside. So I had a guide take me through, and she was really quite interested in knowing what the world thought of China. And whenever we had to talk about it, we could only talk about it when we were riding our bikes, because then she was comfortable that there was nobody listening. There's no doubt in my mind that today she's getting everything she needs to know about what the world thinks of China on the internet. You just can't stop everything. And I think that technology now is probably I'd like to think technology as a good as opposed to an evil. It just has to be better managed.
You, and then maybe a couple more, and then we'll open it up.
Okay.
So just pick one you like there.
I like 2 in here, and I'll pick one. What motivates you?
2 things. Fear. Fear of failure. Fear of failing those around me. So I guess when I grew up, I felt insecure. You just felt like you never had all the chips lined up behind you to be successful. So I always had this fear of failure. So that would be the deepest motivation within me, is just this fear of, man, I don't want to let people down. I don't want to fail. And you probably picked up on that a little bit where's this going? Because I just have this inherent need to not fail. And then also the feeling, especially at this point in my life, that I can make a difference. I truly believe when I wake up in the morning, I can make a difference not only to my family, my wife, my kids, my friends, my clients, Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. I just feel like I can make a difference. And you know what? And I've got to the point where I truly believe I can. And when I went to London about a week ago, and the surprise for me in my London office was we've just put on our very first London office fundraiser for disadvantaged children, specifically youth at risk. And this group of 50 individuals raised tens of thousands of dollars in support of a youth at risk program that was fairly similar to Take a Hike Youth at Risk. And the pride that they had in saying, we did this, and we're now making a difference to our communities, was really cool, because you sat here and said, okay, we started Take a Hike 14 years ago, and here we are supporting something like it in London, years later, and you didn't even have to ask. People just felt motivated to do it because we weren't doing it in London. And so you actually can make a difference, however small. It still can be important. And so I'm motivated by fear, and with that being said, feeling like I can do something useful in the world. Yeah. Is there a part 2 to that question? That's what motivates me. Paranoid I'm forgetting things.
So one question I would like to make sure we ask at some point is you've already talked a little bit about it, women's leadership and diversity. I was wondering if you could talk about what you feel some of the barriers to women are, or what you haven't joined her to that. What are good women leaders doing right?
Yes, because I don't like looking at obstacles only. I like to look at success. So that was the addition. What are the successful female leaders doing right?
Yeah.
In your opinion?
So can you repeat that?
Yeah, we're looking at leadership with respect to women. I'll tie it into a bigger conversation, perhaps. My wife and I created a professorship in leadership studies with a focus with women and people of visible minorities. And I'll give you some background behind the reason for that gift, because it speaks to what motivated it and where we hope to go with it. So I'll start off with my wife, Dana. When I had met her about 14 years ago, she was a top salesperson at a large multinational corporation. And she was in the President's Club, and she just cared deeply about her clients. And so the result was she was at the very top in terms of sales in Canada and she had one of the smallest markets. And frankly, they gave her all the lousy, what they call verticals, and all the guys took all the good ones, because those verticals got them to hockey games and football games and all the fun events. And Dana got stuck with all these lousy verticals where there was no business to be had, and they were lousy businesses. And so she said, fine, you know what, I'll stuff it in their face, and I'm going to succeed, which she did in spades. So they acknowledge her success at a national level, sent all the President's Club people to Paris to celebrate their success. So off we go. I'm on the spousal program, which was kind of cool. I learned how to cook French and saw art, and I loved it. But what was interesting that night that we arrived was the welcome dinner, and the CEO of the organization showed up. Now, the CEO of a very large, multinational, public corporation. My company is one of the largest public investors in Canada. And so we're going through the line, and he is welcoming all of the recipients and welcoming the spouses, gets to Dana, obviously had been tipped off that the CEO of the largest bondholder and shareholder of this company and others in Canada is here, virtually just walked right past her and said hello and wanted to talk business. And there was Dana, just crushed. It was her moment of glory, and he chose to focus on me. I just get so upset with this, than her. And so I directed him back to her and said, you know what? I'm on the spousal program here. I'm not talking business because this is not the place for it. Your business is with Dana, and she was the top. So then he sort of refocused, regrouped, and then focused on Dana. That never left her. And shortly thereafter, we came back to Vancouver, and Dana was pregnant. And so this must have been Luke's 9, so this was 10 years ago. So Dana was pregnant. She's at the top of the food chain, has always told her bosses that she wanted to be management one day, and found out that there was a management role that had not been posted and been given to somebody else. So she went to talk to her managers, and they said, you know what, Dana, you were pregnant, so we figured you didn't want it. So there was the off-ramp. So she quit. That's why when I said Dana chose to stay home, she was completely demotivated by that experience. So that's reason number one. Number two, I went to get a loan when I became partner at Phillips Hager and North. And this speaks to all the barriers, and then they'll talk about opportunities. And so you can only imagine, you get into a firm, you've had nobody really to get you into this company. So there's a whole series of luck that I had to get at Phillips Hager North. And then finally they asked me to become a partner. And the bank manager goes through all the names of the partners. And this is what he did. He goes, Phillips, Hager, North, McGill, Brookshill, Slater, Gage, Cameron, Candy, a few more, Montalbano, what doesn't belong. And mine was the only ethnic name that was not of Anglo-Saxon descent. Our bankers at that time were bankers of the firm for 25 years. And they had 25 years of experience of saying yes to every single partner but me. And every other partner was banked on cash flow, and our business had never been better up until that point. But they just could not get their minds around that a non-Anglo was becoming a partner at Phillips Hager North. They were just imposing this judgment on the firm. So what should have been a slam dunk to get a loan, the loan wasn't sent to me. In fact, they asked my father to co-sign, and he couldn't co-sign because the loan was in the millions. Our net worth was in the thousands as a family. And so I was devastated. So what should have been an incredibly exciting opportunity, just poof, the bubble was burst. And for the first time, I sort of felt like I didn't belong in the professional setting. The partners of the firm at that time, all those names that were sort of held against me, decided that this is just wrong. They fired the bank, and we ended up going to the Royal Bank of Canada, who was just more than happy to take all the business that they can get. And so that had a very important impression on me, and one was very demoralizing, as you can imagine. And you had to fight not to have a chip on your shoulder, which I don't. It was one of those ones that was very challenging. Another background to the chair. My mother, she suffered from mental health issues, like many immigrants do when they come to a new country. They don't speak the language. They have no friends. It's a very lonely place. And if you come from an old society like she did from southern Italy, women were expected to stay home, not be educated, not even drive a car, just make sure dinner's ready at 5 o'clock when I get home. So one day my mom shows up to dinner and just declares that she's got a job and she's going to work. And my dad's like, what do you mean? My dad was a good man, but he was a hard man and he was a traditional Southern European man. He goes, you can't go to work. And she goes, no, I'm going to work. And he goes, back then, she said, Sam, I don't care what you think. I'm going to work. And me and my sister are dead quiet because we thought, oh boy, this is going to get ugly. And he goes, you know and I know that if you go to work, you're putting shame on the family because it means that I, my dad, I am not making enough money to support this family. And so we sat there and thought, oh boy, where's it going now? So my mom just pounded the table and said, Sam, you know you make enough money. They know you make enough money. I know you're going to make enough money. I'm getting a job. In fact, I've got a job and I'm starting tomorrow. So my dad, he went quiet, and for the next umpteen years, my mom was a short order cook at the Coffee Mug at the Bay when there was one down below. And she couldn't have been more proud having that job as a short order cook because she had her own money. But for her, she was a real leader because she was willing to break barriers that existed within her own community. And boy, did the community talk, boy, Sam must not make enough money, just as predicted. But we all held our head up because she was willing to break a barrier for other women around her. And guess what? A whole bunch of other Italian women took on jobs shortly thereafter and told all of their husbands to stuff it. So, true story, and one that, it's funny when you're of Italian descent, you hesitate talking about your mother because everyone thinks you're a mama's boy. But you know what? I'm proud to be a mama's boy because she was a real leader. Now, barriers in the workplace. I touched on it a little bit earlier. A lot of the businesses are set up, and I would say universities are as well, in traditional hierarchical models that do come from almost ancient Anglo-Saxon times. And I don't want to pick on the Anglo-Saxons because it's not fair. They had a female prime minister, and we barely did for about 30 days with Kim Campbell, and that was it. So I would argue the irony is the very models that we have in place right now with organizations, those who founded those models, being primarily continental Europe and the UK, have moved on. There's plenty of examples of female leaders in continental. Merkel is a classic from Germany. She's the most powerful, I would argue, the most powerful person in the world today. Christine Lagarde at the IMF, also one of the most powerful people in the world. The Europeans have acknowledged that gender equality is a right. Here in North America, we're still debating whether Hillary Clinton as president is a novelty issue. And wouldn't that be a real win to have a woman as a leader rather than a great leader who happens to be a woman? So we have these biases that are in place, these hidden biases that exist in most industries. Healthcare, public education, finance is just classic. And when I went to go look for research in general in the industry to find out how to break down barriers in traditional hierarchical structures, especially since my business was bought by the Royal Bank. So I'm going now into 2008 as a flat partnership. I felt that we had a meritocracy. You go into a bank and it gets from lateral tipped up to vertical. Hierarchical structure, very traditional, based on old Anglo-Saxon norms from the 1930s. So I thought to myself, okay, I've inherited, my firm went from 300 people in Vancouver to just under 2,000 around the world. And now I'm responsible for all of them. And it was pretty clear, despite the bank's good intentions, and they are very good, to create equality in the workplace, it was failing, as was every other bank in Canada. So I'm not just picking on the Royal Bank because they're very well intended. But they weren't successful. So I started to undertake research to find out what are the institutional biases, those unknowns, those things you can't see that are preventing well-intentioned organizations from succeeding. And I couldn't find any research. None. In fact, everyone speaks about the book Lean In, and it was a practitioner talking about her experiences for success, but not everyone lives her life, and that doesn't influence how corporate structures are ultimately created and then sustained. So that became the genesis of the professorship at UBC, and the only ask was, stop telling us there's a problem. We all know there's a problem when it comes to gender equality, equity, and I would say the same for visible minorities. Can we accept that there's a problem? Help us find solutions. The research now should morph from there is a problem to we've acknowledged it, let's move on. We had a female partner just retire, Marina Matte. Her and I are actually retiring on the same day on May 1st. We threw her party on Friday night. And I loved what Marina's had to say. Because she, back 30 years ago when she started in the industry, was the first woman in investment management to be client-facing. So most were hidden in the back. You didn't put them in front of clients because there was this perception you had to be a male from Harvard. Nothing wrong with that. But there was the perception that you had to be a male from Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Yale to go in front of the clients. You had credibility. So Dick Bradshaw, the same group that worked for me in terms of moving banking, hired Marina and said, Marina, you're going in front of clients. She almost fell off of her rocker. She was talking about this on Friday night, how she thought, how can they put me in this uncomfortable position? We saw, Dick Bradshaw and the other partners saw it as breaking a barrier. Marina had a great comment. She said, over the years, people have said in our industry, Marina, given all of your experiences, you're an incredible feminist in this industry. And she goes, you know what? I'm not a feminist. Don't call me a feminist. Call me a realist. And I love that line. A realist. The reality is there should be equality and equity for all. It's not something we talk about. It's something we must do. But in the context of trying to do it, there's no one showing us the way in terms of how to properly structure organizations or find hidden biases. And so that's the basis of what this research is for, and Jennifer Bradall would be great. So some of the barriers are, for example, if I talk to my professional women today, they'll say, look, I'm deadly afraid of having a child because it'll derail my career. Not so, but that's the fear. And if the fear is there, then it's a reality that we have to deal with. So what barriers do we have in place that prevent women from confidently having children? As importantly, can the men who have children feel that it's okay and not be ostracized to take paternity leave? Is that okay? We had our first paternity leave about 2 or 3 years ago. And you know what? It was an incredible challenge for that individual because of what he thought everyone thought. But it was pretty seamless for us. Mike, go for it. This is great. You only get one of these chances, unless you have 10 kids, you only get one of these kicks at the can, so go for it. So children is a big one, and it's as much psychological as it is practical. And some businesses have taken the barriers down, but those barriers still exist. Sponsorship and mentorship. It's more apt to see a man get mentorship because there's a natural relationship between men as there are between women. And so men will seek to mentor other young men, or young men will seek mentorship from other men. Now, given that men own the predominant positions in leadership today, given the numbers, guess who gets the mentorship? More often than not, it's the men. And guess who then gets the sponsorship? More often than not, it's the men. So there's a real issue with how mentorship programs are established, either informally or informally, that have yet to been solved for. And I'm pretty certain it happens here at universities as well. So it's these unforeseen things. So for example, I asked a group, we had a very plum position put up and posted it, and I said I want half the candidates to be, the short list to be women and half to be men. We had 5 people do the review process, 3 of which were women, so the majority of the people looking at the applicants were women. We got it down to 20 from about 80, and of the 20, so it started off 40 women, 40 men in the pool, down to 20, 19 men, 1 woman in that final pool of 20. So I sent it back. I said I won't see it until you guys get down to 4, and it's 2 and 2. it's interesting because when you sat down and talked to the women who also sat on my diversity committee, they say it's strange because they catch themselves looking at traditional forms of leadership. Big voices, strong posture, great education, extraordinary oratory skills. That's the definition of a leader. I want to work for that person, or one day I can see that individual being a leader. When what they didn't realize is we weren't asking to fill out a leadership role. We were asking to fill out who is the best qualified for that analyst position, who may or may one day become a leader, but let's just get the right person in first. How does that change the equation? So when people stopped looking for future leaders, guess what? We got the 2 and 2 and a woman got the job. So it's how we look at positions and how we're framing our thinking very early on creates off-ramps for women and people of visible minorities. And the last thing I'd say is that when we created a lot of our work around gender, and we talked about all of the challenges and the biases, I can't tell you how many men of visible minorities came up to me and said, you know what, you know that stuff you're saying about women? I feel that way too. You know, I'm not 6'5", white from Harvard. In fact, you know what? I grew up in East Van and I went to UBC. I have an undergrad. I don't have a graduate degree. And yet I feel just as qualified 25 years later to be in a leadership position. But I'm not leaning in because I just don't feel adequate. And so that's why we tacked on visible minority to the professorship, because there was this recognition that men as well as women were being disadvantaged by the biases entrenched in these organizations. So once again, a long-winded answer to what was a very short question.
Okay, thank you so much. I think, and maybe at this point we'll move to the crowd, and we already have one question.
So thank you very much for coming here. And I wanted to continue your question about women's family and what can you do. So I'm an expecting mother, and I'm just wanting to learn the way society reacts towards that. And since you're mentioning your family quite a lot, I was wondering if you can tell us how can you combine being a very involved family member and a leader in your own family to having a successful career and achieving your goals while dealing with society at the same time?
Yeah, that's a big one. So the question was, how can you balance being a leader with some of the societal challenges of having children, and I would add being a woman with children as well. There are some choices in life too, and that is you can choose to follow what societal norms are, or you can choose to say, I don't care what people think. Which is what my mother did, for example, where she had 2 children, and she decided she was going to go to work. And, you know, frankly, we walked home to work. We no longer had her walking us to school. We just found our way. It turned out just fine. So there are some personal choices where we say, society has it wrong. This is how we're going to do things. That's number one. Number 2 is, does your partner fully embrace the fact that he or she has an equal share in this gig? Which means maternity, paternity. And I'm a strong advocate in our firm that men take paternity if that's what is the right thing for their family. They have to have that opportunity. And why do I feel that way? So Art Phillips, the founder of my company, he came back from politics, and his wife was Carol Taylor. Many of you may have heard of Carol Taylor. She was a finance minister of British Columbia for many years, and feted as one of the greatest female leaders within British Columbia in many, many years. Well, Art stayed home. He stepped out of the business for about 5 years and, quote, raised Samantha while Carol built her career. And between the two of them, they were quite comfortable saying to society, yeah, the decisions are reversed. Deal with it. And Art was so proud about saying he stayed at home to be with his daughter than to come up with some sheepish excuse why he wasn't back in the business, which is very testosterone-laced. So, number 1, that would be it. Number 2, we've had a number of forums with our female leaders at the Royal Bank, everyone from our chairwoman, Katie Taylor, who's the chair of the Royal Bank of Canada, the first banking chair to be a woman in Canada. And we had her, plus the chief financial officer of the Royal Bank, the second most important role in banking. She's a woman. Janice is a woman. So we had Janice and Katie speak to the men and women of our firm, my firm, Global Asset Management. And what they talked about was, there's no such thing as work-life balance. It's a choice. And the choice is where on the pendulum does it feel right for you, relative to whether you're a single mother, a dual working family, a family who's perhaps a husband has the ability to should legally have the ability to take paternity. But often what they found was, with many women, they were afraid to have the conversation with either their employer or with their husband as to what are the sacrifices one will have to make now that we're having a family, so that it's an equal decision amongst the partners as to how the child will be raised. That same conversation has to take place with your employer. Here are the choices that me and my husband have made, and we're asking you to help us figure out how we're going to get this done. So you haven't given them the choice to say, no, I can't help you. You're saying, how are you going to help me? Because this is what we've decided is right for our family. And any employer in their right mind would know that they have a duty to get to the right answer, otherwise they'll lose you. And the risk of loss is far greater than anything else that they can come up with to say they can't help.
Which, by the way, ended up being the case for me.
Pardon me?
Which, by the way, ended up being the case for me.
Yeah.
My supervisor reacted very, very, very badly for me being pregnant, very badly, which ended up in me taking my CHR scholarship and moving to a different supervisor.
Yeah. And that's why I said universities aren't different, and it's frankly, in my mind, criminal. And this should not be allowed. And so but the good news is, if there's a silver lining, you're no longer working with that idiot. Because, supervisors as a boss, they have a duty to keep their people, to make sure that they find a way to work. I mean, funding is always a challenge, and time in the lab is important. But to say that your work is important in the life of someone else's is a challenge. I'm sorry if I was politically incorrect there, but I think that when you get upset, someone's upset because someone's pregnant, that's just wrong. There's no way you can find a right in that answer, in my mind. There could be challenges, and maybe those challenges are indeed perhaps unworkable mutually between the two of you, but it shouldn't get to the point where someone's upset, like, look what you've done to me. You reserve that line for your husband, right? So, anyway. But that's what we try to do, and the husband should have that same conversation with their employer. In fact, it's in law now. Like, there's a duty for people to conform to the law. We've moved on, and many people just haven't embraced or acknowledged a different reality, and I find that frankly offensive.
Well, first, thanks for being here. So you briefly talked about a situation where the leader can foresee the positive or seemingly positive consequences of a decision he's going to make, while all of his colleagues, do not support him, for example, because possibly they don't see the positive consequences of that. And in that situation, so the dilemma here is whether you go with your decision versus the democracy or the decision of others, and how do you deal with that from your experience?
Okay. I can give you a live example of that.
Sure.
So when we were acquired by the Royal Bank of Canada in 2008, Phil Sager North was Canada's leading investment manager for pension funds and endowments. But primarily all we did was Canadian investments. We bought Canadian stocks, Canadian companies, and Canadian bonds. The Royal Bank of Canada was the largest investor in Canada of retail mutual funds and monies for high net worth individuals, so they managed money for individuals. But again, all they did was invest in Canadian stocks and invest in Canadian bonds. So we brought the two businesses together, and what was interesting is both companies were very proud. We were number one in what we did. They were number one in what they did. Now we're supposed to be a we. and we're combining the management teams, and one's from Vancouver of all things, the other one's from, you couldn't get more separate in terms of what we did. And as a leader, I was sitting here thinking, all of these are very good people, incredibly well-intentioned, but then when it came to actually executing, they reverted back to their histories, their traditional corporate norms, and they weren't seeing a middle ground. So I remember gathering 15 of us around the table, and I said, you know, one of the big aspirations that I would like for us, and at the end of my 10-year tenure, will be that we will be a global firm. That 10 years from now, we will invest in global securities. We'll invest in the United States. We'll invest in Europe. We'll have offices in Hong Kong and London. We'll have offices in the United States, none of which we had. We will be seen as a leader in global investment. So as a result, I suggested that we put the word global in RBC Global Asset Management. It was primarily asset management. And part of the reason for doing that, number one, was removing RBC Asset Management as a legacy company, the company that took over the other company. So once you inject global, it's different. But the other thing was, the big debate in our organization was, well, John, there is nothing global about what we do. Okay? Every day we walk in, it's a lie. Like, we don't do anything global, and we're calling ourselves Global Asset Management. And so around the table, over and over and over again, we can't do this because we're not global. And I said, you're right. Every day we walk in and we're not global, we should be ashamed of ourselves. We should be embarrassed that we're not global. And so we're putting the name in. And they're like, you can't do this. I said, you know what? CEO writes, the name goes in starting tomorrow. And so we put the name Global and Global Asset Management, and guess what? Today, we have 450 people in London when we had 4. We manage about 100 billion of our 370 billion. Back then, when we combined the businesses, we managed money for $110 billion worth of assets. Today, we've almost quadrupled it to 400 billion, and we've gone through 3 major market crises in North America, Canada, and also the Europe and Asia. But we quadrupled the business when most other of our competitors have shrunk. Because I think we were aspirational. I thought, for me, the thing that had to happen, which they weren't seeing, was, A, we're relying on our histories, a cultural nightmare. Number 2, we were focused on what we did well versus what we weren't doing. And then number 3, we weren't aspirational. And so by putting that word in, we created a solution for all 3, of which I felt none of them really embraced. And so I made the decision to go against the democratic choice of not doing it. But as a leader, you have to lead. And it's not necessarily a pure democracy where the majority wins. The democracy was, we had a fulsome discussion. I've heard, I've listened, I understand, I acknowledge. I still disagree with you. And so it's my right then as CEO to do something that's clearly unpopular, and I'll own it. But guess what? Tomorrow we should all be embarrassed if we're not global. Right? And so here we are, the only Canadian firm to have globalized itself in the last 10 years. And now we can compete with anybody in the United States, anybody in London, anybody in Europe. We haven't quite done it in Asia, but that will be the opportunity for my successor. Does that give you an example of how does that answer your question?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Thanks.
It was very contentious.
Okay, one and then 2.
Are you familiar with imposter syndrome, and how do you deal with it?
So explain it to me, and then I'll tell you how I deal with it. Thank you.
It's a term I see a lot in academia, where you feel that you don't belong, that you've somehow gotten in above your head,
yeah.
promoted above competence level,
Right.
and that someone is going to find out eventually that you don't belong here.
Right.
And it usually applies to women.
Females.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So yes, I've heard of that. I mean, a lot of the women that I've mentored, and in fact, I wanted to step down completely and redefine myself at 50. And RBC had asked if I would stick around for one more year to mentor women in particular and people of visible minorities across the country. Because there's a heightened sense of insecurity that one doesn't belong, or people invalidate, which is ultimately what you're saying, their successes. One of the challenges with a gender and visible minority agenda is that people start to think they got there only because they're a woman or they're a person of visible minorities. And yet what you're having to convey is, look, not every opportunity is going to someone who falls in the category of either a woman or a visible minority. The opportunities now are based on meritocracy, and we're seeing the world from a slightly different lens. It's an all-encompassing, so you deserve to be here. And where I've seen it most is when I'm about to promote somebody into a senior role, and we get into this, John, I feel like a fraud. Like we've been on this 10-year tailwind, and I just feel like I've been riding the coattails of others. I love those people because they're humble, right? But they're humble to a fault. And if we didn't have the mechanisms of sponsorship and mentorship, they probably would have fallen through the cracks, or they would have been allowed to say no on the invitation to take on a bigger role. And truth be told, there's no doubt in my mind that I felt like an imposter. And I'll tell you when. It was when I was asked to be the chair of the University of British Columbia. I looked around and I thought there were people far more qualified than me. I'm looking around at incredible talent at the university who forget in a day anything I'll ever learn for the rest of my life when it comes to the university, and I'm asked to chair this thing. I remember going back home and saying to Dana, I don't feel qualified for this. And her answer was, good, first time in a long time. and she was right. Good. I'm out of my comfort zone. Great. So how do you get people to step away from feeling like a fraud and embrace the risk of putting themselves in a very uncomfortable place? I see it all the time, and I felt it just recently myself. How do you deal with it? We've had people who have said no to opportunity, literally coming in crying, I can't do this, I'm not capable of doing it, I'm not qualified. And one person more or less used the term fraud, and this has happened with an individual. Her name, I won't say the last name, but Rebecca was my communications person. She was poached by the bank to do a big, huge role, and she felt she was riding the coattails of the success of our organization. She was rated exceptional in everything she did, but she felt that because we were successful, there was nothing we could have done that would have been unsuccessful. And so therefore then she wasn't qualified for this role, which was dealing with a mess. And she felt she can deal with success, but she couldn't deal with failure, like other people's failure, and somehow communicate out of it. And we literally had to get her 3 sponsors, myself, JF, and George, to sit here and say, no, Rebecca, you can do this. And in fact, you know what? Failure is not an option. What are the resources you need to feel comfortable? You see it all the time, and I just don't think, the duty of a leader is to make sure people work through those insecurities. I'm not sure if that answers your question at all, but go ahead, you've got that quizzical, go for it.
I'm mulling it over, but I think that does sort of answer the question. It's about reframing what it feels like to be out of your comfort zone and not thinking that that's a bad thing to be uncomfortable.
Well, I don't think it's bad at all. I've been, my whole life I've been, fearing failure is also the same thing as feeling insecure about oneself. You have to make sure that insecurity manifests itself in a positive way rather than in a devious way where, I'm going to even the playing field by creating failure in others, and that brings them down. What that insecurity has to do is bring you up. That energy brings you up relative to those around you. The challenge with people in this room, I would argue, is that you've always been the smartest people in the room. And what happens on that one day where you don't feel like you are? Are you a fraud? Or for the very first time in a long time, you're out of your comfort zone? Frankly, the issues that I've had was, for me, the bigger challenge is we've hired a lot of PhDs, and I've had to let a lot of them go because they've never been wrong. They've never understood that. Well, the realities of the world are very different than a contained place. And mistakes should be acknowledged, embraced, and not placed on the shoulders of others. You have to own it, accept it, learn from it, and people will feel like you're calling them a fraud for saying that they were wrong, as opposed to they've always been right. So there's a flip side to that I've dealt with as well, where the imposter is one who hasn't acknowledged a mistake and will not acknowledge or own a mistake because they've always been right all their lives. They've always been the smartest person in the room. And so there's a flip side to that argument as well that I've seen that unfortunately I've had to deal with. And in grave circumstances.
Hi,
Hi.
John. Thank you for your sharing. I'll start saying that I feel outside my comfort zone now. But I wanted to ask you around the word success. The way you define it seemed to me, especially personally, beautiful. But in the way we are running our systems or our universities or economies, like the word success is loaded with a lot of things that are causing a lot of inequalities and oppression. It deals with efficiency and how many papers do you publish, how fast. The definition of leadership is surrounded with words of, body posture and the tone of your voice, things that are very masculine. And I just want to bring a quote by Eduardo Galeano, who is like a journalist and from Latin America, an amazing writer, who was talking about success as saying that we are sick of successism. I'm making this word that the world is oppressed with this system of values that places success above all of our virtues, and that that condemns us to and that failure is the only sin that has no redemption, and so that we are condemned to succeed and succeed all the time, just in the context of this definition of success. And so my question is, like, are we wrong in the goal that we are trying to pursue in our lives? Like, what kind of success are we pursuing? Are we pursuing the wrong goal? And if yes, how do you see, or what advice do you have for us to challenge the way the world is telling us to succeed? Is it clear?
Yeah, I got it completely. And I agree with that. I mentioned earlier how in my world, the two basic drivers are fear and greed. And greed takes people into incredibly dark places, and success is measured by the accumulation of wealth or stature. And when you look back, there's a lot of roadkill along the way. The path to that success has left a lot of people damaged, whether it's your clients, your customers. I see it in universities as well. I'm not going to lie. We talked about some of the dynamics with the universities. It's an incredibly stressful period where you have to publish. You're striving for a certain thing. But one of the things that I come back to is a sense of purpose. I don't think enough people stop before they enter into things and say, what's the purpose of this? Like, why am I doing this? Universities should be a great place for asking the question, why? Don't you think? And that's what we're asked to do here, is ask why, and then get to the how. But do we do that for ourselves? How often have you sat down and said, what is my purpose? Like, what is my purpose to fall into that rat race or is my purpose to create great science and maybe take the risk of being contrarian and different from what those around me tell me I will be judged by? I'll decide how I will be judged. And can I co-opt those around me to agree that that's how I should be judged? Sometimes you can't, at which point then you've got a crossroads in your life that perhaps your core values can't be reconciled with the organization that you're in. And a lot of people will then compromise their core values by saying, you know what, I'm here, I worked so hard to get here, I'm here now, so I'll just put that aside and I'll play the game. And there's others who will say, I'm not going to play the game. You know what, I refuse. And as long as they've been coached well and are not dogmatic and don't see realities but can work within the reality, I believe, and I'm a big believer, that one defines success by the way I've defined it earlier. But everyone's personal in terms of how you define success, but I don't think it's through materiality. I frankly believe that purpose comes from contribution to, and you can fill in the blank. Last week we went to, I took a number of individuals purposely in the industry in Vancouver who are very successful in their money management firms, they don't donate a dime to communities. And they're some of my competitors. They were some of my employees. And we took them to a program called Man Up. And Man Up is at Templeton High School. And it's a boys' club. And the boys' club is a club for ultra-high-risk youth. And many kids have come from Latin America, from Africa, single mothers. Mothers are working 2 jobs. They fall through the cracks. They're with youth and family workers, gang-related issues. And so this program's been going on for about 10 years. And it's saved a lot of boys. But it's intense. These boys are as challenging as it's going to get. And they did a play around 4 experiences of the boys' club called Man Up. And so I brought people to East Vancouver for the very first time. They were scared to death just to venture into Templeton. But you know what? They did it. I give them a lot of credit. And at the end of it, and Dana, my wife, was with me as well. And we, at the end of it, there was not a dry eye because it was the most intense experience that you can actually go through. And there was young boy actors. One boy was acting himself. It was his life on stage that was being portrayed. And at the end of it, one of the individuals I took to this thing, he says, thanks, he was from West Van, lovely person. He said, I've never been introduced to a sense of purpose. I just feel like I've got some purpose now. I don't know what it is, but we're going to talk about this when we get home. And for me, that was a success. Now, how is that measured conventionally? I don't know. But I felt like I can contribute to an individual's life. I can contribute to my employees. I can contribute to those above me at the Royal Bank, and I've done a lot to get them to think more about communities and gender and diversity and other things that I don't think they've done enough of. So success should be measured in different ways depending on certain circumstances, but it doesn't have to be measured by wealth. And I think that's been a big challenge these days, and people are really caught up in measuring themselves in ways that are not truly material to what affects the world. And I don't know how to, it's 1% of the time on that one, really. And I don't know what to do about it. But I can only look at what I can control and say, can I live up to my personal measure of success, which I think is aligned with strong community values. So I'm hopeful for the world based on some of the things that we talked about, but there's always going to be challenges, and I deal with them all the time. On your imposter thing, there was we had a case where one person insisted on not taking the job, and we asked, under what circumstances would you, it was an Indian male in this case, under what circumstances would you take this job? And he goes, I am not qualified for it. So our question was to him, what do you need to be qualified? Tell us what you need to be qualified. Because you think you're not. What's that gap that you're... We don't see it, but we believe you. You feel this way. So tell us what that gap is. And it was interesting. From his perspective, he didn't have public speaking experience. He didn't know how to stand up and give presentations and hold a room of 30 people. So what we did was we found what we thought was the most successful public speaking, a very expensive course, and we threw him at it for 6 weeks. Didn't see him for 6 weeks in Toronto, and said, come back to us. They'll tell us whether you're ready. Then you tell us whether you're ready. It was interesting. The organization, this was the Humphrey Group that did it, said this person's a rock star. He's outstanding. He came back and said, I'm not ready. He still took the job. And you know what? He's been exceptional. But it's also not just arguing with people that, I know you feel this way, but what resources can I give you to get you to a better place? That conversation often stops at I'm not qualified. And you get into this, yes you are, no I'm not, yes you are. That's not helpful. It's resources.
Hi. So thank you for being here this afternoon. I feel like you've talked about the hope you have in the young generation, the importance of giving them opportunities, and that older established leaders shouldn't get too comfortable in their position and should eventually move on.
Yeah.
If I were to paraphrase. And so given that many of us are aspirational, or many of us aspire to become professors, I guess my question to you is how do you feel about UBC's policy with tenure for professors and the fact that they choose when they would like to retire, which I think
Yeah, that's
what
good.
follows is
Yeah, no, I'm,
yes.
yeah, it's everywhere. I fundamentally understand tenure and the sense of intellectual security that it gives. So I won't debate tenure. I will debate, though, that when someone wakes up in the morning and they know they are no longer contributing or meeting the expectations of those around them, that they do have a duty at some point to step down and let others come in and fulfill that role, because those individuals will create a greater contribution to society than whatever these people feel. So I think tenure is a requirement to protect, especially a research-intensive university, from some of the influences that can creep in, specifically from government. Having said that, I don't believe it's an entitlement. But the only person who can determine whether they're entitled or not is the individual who has it. And I do think that there hasn't been enough time working with the most senior faculty or with people who are moving up the tenure track to really understand that tenure is a privilege. It's not an entitlement. But you as the individual have the opportunity to opt out whenever you think is the right time, but too often people morph into the world of entitlement as opposed to understanding it's a privilege. If someone's conducting great research in their 70s, God bless them for that. But if they haven't produced and they're not mentoring and they're not teaching and they're not, then it's unfortunate.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more.
We've talked about enfranchisement of women and visible minorities. What role do you think leaders, organizations and institutions have in mental health of their employees and work with and for?
Yeah, mental health is a big one. My mother suffered from severe depression, and a couple times as a child came home to her having attempted suicide. And so the mental health issue is a very important one to me. And I don't think we're not doing anywhere near enough when it comes to mental health. And we're addressing this at the university as well, because there's actually a mental health issue at the university. The pressures that you've probably seen it in spades with the incredible pressure that you have at this point in your careers. But we've seen it in so many different ways. International students who come here, in many cases, are abused in so many different ways, despite the support networks that are in place. Mental health issues that are just born into them. And you know what? I'm thrilled that for the first time ever, I think, in the last 5 years, mental health is now something that people can talk about comfortably, and say that this is something that is yet to be addressed. It's still stigmatized, and I think that's a real tragedy that I think at some point we'll be able to overcome. My mother was, she was clinical on Valium, and on her good days she was great, brilliant. Dana, my wife, will say, for a woman who had a grade 5 education, she was one of the wisest people she'd ever met. And Dana has a degree. And so, that you have to get past what you see. There's this great saying in the downtown east side where I do some work, and it's look past the look and see what you see. What that means is when you're in the downtown east side and you see the look of the homeless looking at you, you tend to see the homeless and just stop your judgment there. Actually, what you don't see is someone who's suffering from mental health issues and has had no support networks or has had the inability to find those support networks. And so you just look at the look, but you don't see what you're actually seeing. What you're seeing is there's a real unspoken problem here in the downtown east side. And so mental health is one of those issues where, first of all, how do you identify it? If you do, what can you do about it? And often you just refer it to others to deal with as opposed to saying we own these, which I believe. I think if we invite people on this campus and we say it's a safe place, then mental health has to be one of the security nets that we should be providing our students, our faculty, our staff, our employees. But the truth is, every business, including my own, is inadequately equipped to deal with that specific issue. The good news is, much like we talked about with gender equality, it's now being spoken about, and that to me is important. It's one of the issues that I hope to deal with when I step down in a couple of weeks and look at refocusing some of my efforts. One of them will be on mental health, specifically with respect to the immigrant community. I can't tell you how many taxi rides I've taken around the world, but specifically in Canada, more than anywhere else, the taxi driver is a clinical physician, a physicist, an accountant, an engineer, and somehow they're not qualified to work here. And then you ask them, how did that impact you? That must have been really rough. I cry every day. I'm depressed. I'm on medicine. And you want to get out of the cab at that point because it's Valium. But you start to hear the true stories of, well, you know, it's not only just opportunity for the children, it's they have been lied to by our system, that we say that we will take your education, we will value it here, we even put points on it, and then you're only qualified to drive a cab. That just drives me nuts. And so one of the things I hope to get involved in is dealing with some of these key issues that I think influence us as a nation. Mental health is a big one. I don't have a great answer for you other than we have to acknowledge it's an important issue.
I think perhaps the time has kind of come to a near end and the food has arrived. And John says 7 more minutes with us. So I think we will just terminate the discussion. You're welcome to mingle here and maybe John will answer a few questions. But I did want to say thank you so much to John.
Oh,
and this is a little bit sorry. And for a life that you live, 2 hours is a massive gift to us. So thank you very much for that gift.
Thank you for making the time. Thank you. Appreciate that.